Hello, my name is Madeline. I am a sewing pattern designer and I am so excited today to teach you how to make the Capella Coat. The Capella Coat is a reversible quilted jacket sewing pattern with a hood and with an elastic back channel so that you can adjust it to your desires. This pattern is such a fun one, and something that was so important to me when making this pattern was to make it beginner friendly despite it being an involved pattern. And so this video tutorial and the instruction booklet are designed with beginners in mind. It is an adventurous beginner sewing pattern, and I'm going to walk you through every step on how to make this sewing pattern in this video. For this video tutorial, you will need the pattern. The pattern will walk you through every single step. This is meant to accompany that pattern. I will put that link below in the description, but you will need this pattern to be able to complete the entire process. I am going to teach you how I would quilt your fabric if you are choosing to do that. That means sandwiching 3 layers of fabric together, or 2 layers of fabric and a layer of batting together. I'm going to show you the methods that I use. I'm going to show you how to add bias binding and create continuous bias binding. I'm going to show you how to assemble the pattern and my methods that I found were the best for this on how to use that continuous bias binding and to use it in this pattern. You're going to learn how to make patch pockets if you want an optional hood with a drawstring channel, and how to add elastic to the waistband. So many fun things we're going to learn today. I am so excited to show you, and I'm really excited to show you the fabrics that we're going to use and talk more about this pattern. Before we continue, I just want to say, if you ever have any questions with one of my patterns, please feel free to leave a comment below this video and I'd love to answer them, or you can email me at hello@madswick.com. I'm here to help. That's what my job is, and I love doing it, and I love helping you on your sewing journey. I also just want to excuse my voice. I seem to have lost it slightly, but today is the day to record, so I just sound a little bit lower voice than usual, and that's okay. So we talked a little bit about this sewing pattern. I've already shown you some clips of it, and something to keep in mind before we move forward is what you are going to make. Are you going to make it with the hood, or are you going to make it without the hood? I just want you to think about that and decide. That will help you going forward, because that will help you make decisions as we go through the process. I'm going to be making both options in this video. So anytime that we are doing something that is different, the only thing that is different about the 2 patterns is you will make the hood and then attach it, or not make the hood and attach it, but attaching the neck binding is exactly the same. If that makes no sense, don't worry, it will make sense, but I will be showing both versions for you as we go throughout the pattern, and I will explain that in just a moment, but just know that I'm going to walk you through both ways so you will get answers for both ways, okay? Let's talk a little bit about this. The general seam allowance is included in this pattern, so you don't need to add seam allowance. The general seam allowance is about 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter, but it is specified at all the steps so you know where to do your seam allowance and everything like that. The difficulty level, like I said, adventurous beginner. The pattern is only for personal use. If you are wanting it for commercial use, you need to reach out and get permission from me. And sizing. This pattern is my first pattern with 16 sizes, so I added 1 smaller size, so I now have sizes 0 through 15 on this pattern. My previous patterns have 1 through 15, and this one has 0 through 15. I had a few people saying that my patterns weren't quite small enough for them, so I added that size. This pattern has a boxy fit, but it's not super oversized, right? This is more of a lightweight coat. It is recommended that you use the lightweight fabric, and so I'm anticipating that you're going to be wearing some long sleeves underneath it, but that you're not wearing bulky layers. If you are wanting to wear a lot of bulky things underneath, I would consider sizing up at least 1. So it's drafted for somebody who is 5'6", which is 1.68 meters. I should have thought that math through better. With somebody with a BC cup size. This was tested across the size range by over 50 incredible testers of all different bust sizes, and that did work for everybody of different bust sizes as long as you picked the size based on your bust measurement. So be sure to take your body measurements today, not from last month, not from last year. Take your body measurements from today. The most important measurement you need to check is your bust measurement. I do have a video, and I will link it below, that shows you how to properly measure yourself. And I walk you through how I would recommend doing that and how to best pick the size based on your sizes. That is the only key measurement that I would go off of for this specific pattern. But the other thing I would check is your bicep. So the bicep measurement, the final garment bicep measurement, is included in the finished garment measurements. And I would recommend you measure your bicep and compare them with the bicep measurements in here before you start, because that would be the only other place that I would say is fitted. But I wouldn't say it's fitted. There's ease in there, but that's the only other place that could be a variable you may want to consider. So your bust and your bicep, I would say, are your biggest key measurement indicators, and I would check those before selecting your sizing, and I would watch the video. Okay, so make sure you check out the size chart, pick the right size. You know if you're making a hood, you know if you're not making a hood, you now know what size you're gonna do. Now it's time to pick fabric. So this fabric is meant to be like a lightweight quilted fabric. You can quilt your own fabric, or you can buy pre-quilted fabric. So let me show you an example. This is a pre-quilted fabric. This one I bought from Hey Sew's sister. I will link it below if it's still available or similar. And this one was hand block printed in India, and it has a cotton batting. This one is very lightweight. This is something I would recommend. I would also recommend you could do something like this. This is a polyester quilted fabric with polyester batting and polyester sherpa. I'm not normally a big polyester fan, but I really wanted a weather type jacket. So I'm very excited about this. I got this from Nomura Taylor, and I will link it below. I really like this one. I'm very excited about it. I do think that the only other place I've seen that has it is Blackbird Fabrics. Something like that would be great for this pattern. Or you could also quilt your own fabric, which is what I did with this sample. This is one of the fabrics that I designed in collaboration with the Linen Lab. So this is one of my flower designs. This is on linen, and then this is on a linen rayon blend, this fabric. And I quilted those pattern pieces together, those fabrics together, and kind of this, it's hard to see on this side, in this diamond shape quilt pattern look, which I will be showing more about later. But I did that with a cotton batting on the inside. Another thing that you could do is you could upcycle a quilted quilt or you could upcycle a quilt from Target or wherever you're finding it, or from the thrift store. Just making sure it's not too heavyweight. This pattern wasn't intended for bulky quilts. If you do want to do that, I would recommend sizing up, because the more bulk the thickness of that fabric, the less ease you're going to have in your arms, your bust, your hips, shoulders, everywhere. So if you are picking a thicker fabric, I would consider sizing up, possibly 1 or 2 sizes. Like I said, this is meant for a light to medium weight pre-quilted fabric, and I do have weights in there around 200 to 300 grams per square meter, or 6 to 12 to 9 ounces per square yard. Just keep that in mind, that this is meant for a lightish to medium weight one, not a super heavy, bulky fabric. In the pattern instructions, you will see that there are instructions, and I will walk you through. You can use pre-quilted or quilt it yourself. I give quite a few instructions in the pattern booklet, so I won't go as much into detail here about all the variations, but you could quilt stripes, you could quilt diamonds, you could quilt squiggly lines, you could quilt all of those things. I'll show images right here for you. You can quilt it however you like. You could do it by hand, you could do it by machine. I want you to have fun with this pattern. That's what is amazing about quilted garment patterns, is that they just require love and detail, and they're just so fun to make. So I hope that you have so much fun making this. Now, apart from fabric, you will need another fabric for this pattern. If you are quilting it yourself, you can just use that fabric for the bias binding, or if you're using a pre-quilted fabric, you will need to get an additional fabric for the bias binding. So this is one I've already cut. This is my bias binding for this version, and I went ahead and cut this one, but I will be showing you how to do it. But you can see it's different, right? So I've got my outer fabric, I've I've got my inner fabric, and I've got a bias binding fabric. The bias binding fabric will also be used for parts of your pocket and for the pocket trim that goes down the front of your pattern. So it's fun, you can have fun and pick something really fun, or like this version, my cotton version, my quilted cotton version, I'm going with something really subtle and simple. I'm just using a blue linen. I kind of wanted it to blend in because the stripes are so fun. So this is what you will see on the inside and a little bit on the outside. So I just picked a blue linen, and I will be cutting bias binding for this later. This is just one of the pattern pieces that needs to be cut out. All right, in addition to all the fabric that you need, so you need your quilted fabric or the fabric that you will be quilting, in addition to a binding fabric. You also need some notions. So you're gonna need 1 to 2 spools of matching thread. If you are quilting your own fabric, I would highly recommend getting at least 2 spools of thread so that you do not run out. Make sure that it matches to your heart's content. If that means contrasting thread for you, that's great. I chose on one side for this, I did a slightly darker tan thread on this side, and then I did a black thread on this side. And so I did that. One was in my bobbin, the tan was in my bobbin, and then the black was in my top loader thread. You will need buttons. So you will need 10 to 12 buttons, 10 buttons if you are in the lower half of the size range, and 12 buttons if you are in the top bigger half of the size range. That's just because as the pattern gets larger outwards, it also grows slightly with length. And so if you are in the top half of the size range, you're gonna need an additional button to account for that extra length. Those need to be about 5/8 of an inch or 1.6 centimeters big. That can change a little bit. You could go a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller. Just keep in mind that if you go too much bigger, you may have trouble doing the horizontal buttonholes. You can flip them vertical if you would like. So for this pattern, I'm going to be with this version. I have these adorable little quilted buttons. I think actually I'll do those on this side, as well as these incredible croissant buttons, which I absolutely love, also from Hey Sew Sister, that I will be using. And then for my green version, I'm going to be using these amazing quilty brass buttons. I also had a lot of testers do snaps. This isn't in the pattern officially, but of course you could swap out the buttons for snaps. Make sure that you test them on a fabric swatch if you've never done snaps before, as sometimes they can be a little bit finicky. You're gonna need a hand needle for some portions of this. There's a lot of stitching in the ditch. I would recommend, if you're being very conscious about how your sewing looks and really taking your time with it, I would recommend doing some slip stitching. I will most likely be machine sewing for this tutorial due to the nature of time. But if you have a little bit of extra time at night, I would recommend slip stitching your binding clothes. It's a methodic, beautiful process, and you will end up with the most beautiful result. You also will need elastic. So I get non-roll 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter wide elastic. The yardage for that is on page 8 of the instruction booklet, so you can see how much you need. I lied. The elastic yardage is on page 10, right underneath the yardage guides for your binding fabric. So all of the yardage charts are in the pattern. And if you need to look at that, it will tell you. So for example, I make size 3, and on page 10, it tells me that I need 19 inches of elastic, which is 48 centimeters. So that's what I'll be using. Then you're gonna want some good quality pins. You could also use the clips if you have those. I have never bought them. Tell me in the comments if I should. You will need a safety pin to guide your elastic through a channel. And I would recommend using a walking foot if you have one, if you are quilting your own fabric. If you are quilting that fabric together, having a walking foot basically just adds presser feet onto your feed dog. It adds feed dogs to the top, to your presser foot, so that it's moving the fabric from the top and the bottom instead of just the bottom. Some people also really enjoyed during testing having a hump jumper, which is essentially just something that you wedge under your presser foot in the back to kind of help it get over the big bumps. I personally don't usually use one, but if you want one, that might be something worthwhile, or you can even just fold up a piece of paper and put it behind the back of your presser foot. I am not an expert in that tool, but lots of people did say that they were helpful. You also will need a marking tool. I would recommend using some form of tailor's chalk that you feel comfortable with. I'm also still on the search for the perfect tailor's chalk, but you're also welcome to look for that. Or you could use a Hera marker. I don't have a Hera marker at the moment, it got lost, but you will see in the video tutorial that I just used my seam gauge to mark lines for my quilting. It also worked great. I've also used my daughter's Play-Doh tools, so don't feel like you have to go like running out and buying all these things. Use what you have. Like I mentioned, we'll be making our own bias binding for this video tutorial and for this pattern. You can buy pre-made bias binding. I would recommend making your own, one, because I think that you'll be able to get a better match, and two, because I do think that you will have a better experience with it in the long run. Like I said, this is some of my pre-made bias binding. When it is not folded together, it is 5.5 centimeters wide, which is the equivalent of roughly 2 inches. It's just slightly over 2 inches. And then what we do is we fold it in half, and that is how we will use it for the entirety of the pattern. So if you're able to find pre-made bias binding that is 2 inches wide or 5.5 centimeters wide, that is folded in half just once instead of folded. Sometimes bias binding will come in the package and it will be folded kind of like this. It will be folded in half like that and then folded again. We don't want that. We want it just folded in half. I will have so many fluffies during this video. I would recommend making your own, but there is yardage information on page 8 so that you are able to order pre-made bias binding if you would like. Like I said, you have to decide if you're gonna do hood or not hood. The yardage information for that is on page 9 and on page 10. There are 9 pattern pieces in this pattern. There are only 6 if you are not doing a hood, but then if you are doing the hood, you need to cut out pattern pieces 7, 8, and 9. And then we will additionally cut out pattern piece 10, which is not an actual pattern piece, but it is the bias binding. Make sure that you print out your pattern. You have options to print out the AO file, the print at home, which is the A4, the US letter size file, or to project it on your projector. And then once you have printed it out, you can look at the pattern adjustment guides on pages 14 through 15. Now, this pattern, like I said, was drafted for somebody who is 5'6", or 1.68 meters, and you may or may not like the length of the bodice or of the sleeves. Those final garment measurements are given in the pattern, so you are welcome to adjust those. Of course, I would always recommend making a simple toile, just using some old bed sheets and just testing out the pattern before making any adjustments. But that information on how to make those adjustments is there for you in the pattern. And then go ahead and start cutting out your fabric. Now, there is a cutting layout guide. It is just a general guide. I give some tips and tricks in the pattern on how to reduce fabric consumption. I always start with my biggest pieces first. I always kind of fiddle with it and I'm really, really creative with how I'm folding my fabric and how I'm laying things out to save on fabric consumption as much as possible. Once you have gotten to there, take a deep breath because that was a lot. I do have a little checklist on page 16 that walks you through just to make sure that you have gotten everything that you need to. So I recommend pre-washing your fabric before cutting it out, print your pattern or project it, cut out your fabric, make sure you have all of your notions ready to go, make a toile. If you're gonna make any fitting adjustments, making those fitting adjustments, wind a couple of bobbins, get your machine ready, and then we're ready to sew. Okay, go grab a glass of water. We are gonna start sewing, and the first thing we're going to do is we are gonna learn how to quilt. If you are using pre-quilted fabric, you can scrub forward to a different time. You can scrub forward to this timestamp to continue working on the bias binding. All right, so we're gonna learn how to quilt our own fabric, and with quilting our own fabric for this pattern, you have cut out your pattern a little bit differently. So you've cut out everything on the gray lines of the paper pattern pieces or the blue lines of the projector pattern pieces. And you need to sandwich your pattern together. You need to sandwich those fabric pieces together with the lining fabric that you will be using, and the batting, and then the outer fabric that you will be using. So we've got fabric 2, which will be the inside of your fabric. We have the batting, which will be in the middle, and fabric 1, which will be on top. And we'll squish those together. And you're gonna pin those pieces together. And then you are going to sew the lines however you like. And then once you are done quilting those pattern pieces together, you're going to cut off the gray lines to just the black lines of your sewing pattern, and you are going to cut it to the correct size. The reason that I have you doing this is because quilting entire meterage of fabric is incredibly time consuming and hard on a domestic sewing machine. And if you have to quilt all of that fabric together and then cut it out, you also have a lot of fabric wastage. So what we've done here is I've just created a quilting allowance on all of these pattern pieces, and you are just going to reduce that once you are done, because sometimes when you quilt fabric, it kind of shrinks or it kind of bunches up a little bit. So you do have to cut out the pieces twice, but I promise the end result will be worth it, and it will actually be much easier in the end than having quilted all of the fabric at once. I would recommend starting with smaller pattern pieces. So in this tutorial, I am showing you the pocket pattern piece, but the same principles apply on the bigger pattern pieces. So I have some tips in there on how to quilt. I would recommend that you start with the smaller pattern pieces, use a walking foot if you can, sew all of your stitches in the same direction. Don't go down one way and then flip the pattern piece and go the other way. Make sure they're all going in the same direction. If you're doing checks, do one direction, complete the whole way, and then flip, and then do the other direction every single line. Now, another thing to note is that I would go slow. I would increase your stitch length a little bit because you're dealing with thicker fabric. And I would make sure that if you can also start at the middle of the pattern piece and work your way out. Those are some general tips for quilting. If you have any other tips or questions, please leave them in the comments below. I'd be happy to help. All right, the next thing we're going to do is cut out your bias binding. So once you're ready, grab your binding fabric that you have selected.
There are some things in sewing that just feel like magic, but I think that continuous bias binding might be the #1 thing. It's when you take a square of fabric and you turn it into bias binding that looks insanely long for how little of fabric you use. For example, this is a full tutorial, and I don't think you'll ever need any other resource for continuous bias binding ever again.
Now we're going to calculate the amount of bias binding that you need. So take the total length that you need, and we're going to times it by the width of bias binding that you would like. And then once you've done that, we're going to take the square root of that number, put it in your calculator, and round up. So do that plus the seam allowance times 2. For me, that was 56 centimeters, and that I'm going to do that and make sure it's a perfect square. So I'm cutting that out. I'm double checking, see my seam was a little bit off, and then you cut that square in half to create 2 triangles. Flip those open, and we're going to mark on each side. I've done O's and X's, and this is just going to help us line things up correctly. So if you can see, I'm flipping it over and I'm putting my O's together. I switched it to right sides, and now I'm going to be pinning those in place. You're going to shift over that by 1 centimeter because that's our seam allowance. So there will be a little bit of a triangle hanging off the edge as you sew that across. Then you're going to iron that seam open, and you're going to mark every 5.5 centimeters because that's what I chose for my width. If you have any excess fabric, cut that off. You shouldn't, but I did, so I'm cutting it off. Then you're going to take the X's and the other X and you're going to place them with right sides together. We're kind of folding this all up together, and I'm going to offset those lines by 1. So normally they'd line up to make a perfect square, but we're offsetting them by 1, sewing them together, pressing that seam open again, and then we're going to slowly but carefully cut on our lines that we marked. And basically we're cutting around and around and around and around all the way till the end until you have so much bias binding. Then take it over to your iron, fold it in half and roll it up, and you will have beautiful continuous bias binding for your next big project. Now I think it's important to note that I have already calculated how much bias binding you need. Go ahead and find that number and you can go ahead and use that tutorial to create the amount that you need total. Now I have worked in a little bit of extra space in there for bias binding, but if you accidentally cut it a little bit wider or a little bit thinner, it may throw it off. So don't be afraid. If you need to do it again, make a little bit more or something like that. It'll be fine. You know how to do it. All right, we're gonna go ahead and work on the pockets. So grab the pockets that you're going to be using. That floral side is going to be my fabric side 1, and I'm opening up the raw edges of my bias binding just to show you that that's what we're doing. We're putting the raw edges next to the raw edge of this quilted pocket pattern piece. Remember, everything's quilted now. We have our bias binding cut out, and I'm gonna go ahead and cut the excess off of the bias binding along that top edge of the pocket. And now I'm pinning the bias binding around that curve and around these edges of my pocket. Around the curve, I stretch the bias binding just a little bit. You don't need to go overboard, but you do need to stretch it just a little bit to get it to go around that curve. And then do not stretch it when you're on the flat side. You don't want to be stretching out your bias binding unless you're around a curve. So now I just cut it off to be the right length, and I did it on both pocket pattern pieces. I'm going to go over to my machine and I'm going to go ahead and sew that with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. I'm going to go around those curves as good as I can. Obviously, I'm going to be removing my pins, but you will notice that I might not throughout this video, and I apologize in advance because I sometimes don't. So I've got that 1 centimeter seam allowance. I backstitched, secured that in place, and I've done it with both, and we're good to go. Now we need to trim down our seam allowance. So you're not going to want to trim it down too far, but I did it about 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters. You could go a little bit smaller, but you definitely do not want to cut into your stitching. The reason we're cutting this down is it's going to help reduce some of the bulk. When we're dealing with a heavier weight fabric, which this is because it has quilted, and even though this is lightweight, it's still just going to create thickness, right? So now we're taking that binding and we're folding it to the fabric 2 side. And you can see right here, I don't want this bias binding hidden. I want to wrap it around the seam allowance, but it should be visible from both the front and the back. We're going to pin this in place as best as we can. And you just want to take your time on this to make it feel even and beautiful from both sides. Now I'm going to go ahead and get my hand needle and I'm going to thread it with some thread as best as I can. And I'm going to tie a knot at the end. So basically I've just got 2 strands of string with a knot at the end, and I'm going to do a slip stitch. Now this is from the fabric 2 side, and I'm just securing this in place. Now this slip stitch is really more of a slip basting. I did it a little bit nicer than I probably needed to, but you can make these pretty loosey-goosey because we are going to be securing these down when we top stitch it onto the front bodice. But if you want to make sure it's extra secure, then do those slip stitches, I don't know, 1 or 2 millimeters apart. But if you're not too worried about it, really it is more of a basting. You can get a little bit further apart, maybe go 1/2 centimeter to 1 centimeter apart on these slip stitches. I would be careful to go a little closer on those curves just to make sure, because we're going to be slipping in the ditch, but I think that looks really nice like that. And then we're going to do that to the other side. So now both are good and ready to go. We're gonna get that pocket topper pattern piece. We've got 2 of them, and we're gonna take it over to the iron. And this is gonna be a little bit fun. We're going to fold it in half, and you can kind of see on my page, on my fabric, I wrote wrong side because it's hard to tell what the wrong side is. And on the wrong side, we're folding wrong sides together, and we did it in half, and now we're gonna fold it up to that fold again. So it's about 1 centimeter. And then I folded it with right sides together on that pre-folded mark. So I know it feels so silly. We just folded it with the wrong sides together, and now we're like going backwards against that pre-pressing, but I promise it will work out. So once again, we're doing that again. I'll let you just watch and see what I'm doing. All right, and now we're going to, how we have it pinned, we're going to sew the side seams with a 1 centimeter seam allowance and trim those corners. Now we're gonna flip it right back. Oh, not yet. I forgot what I was doing for a second. Watch me remember. There we go. Now we're gonna flip it out. So we're gonna flip it. So now all of those pre-pressed seams are gonna make so much more sense. They are ready to go. And then we are going to put raw edges together at the top of the pocket, and we are going to pin them in place. Now you wanna make sure that this is all lining up, that the lengths are all correct. There's a chance that when you did the binding that you may or may not have done a slightly bigger or smaller seam allowance. So if it's not quite fitting the pocket topper, just change the seam allowance of your pocket topper and try again. Now we're sewing that on, make sure you back stitch, and we're going to do some magic right here, and we're going to flip the pocket topper around to the fabric 2 side. This is actually me doing it the second pocket, so we'll get to that in a second. But we're doing the second pocket, and then we are going to flip that over to the fabric 2 side. And now we've like encased this pocket just beautifully and perfectly. Now you are going to pin this in place, and you want to make sure that you are covering that stitching. You can either slip and stitch in the ditch. So from the fabric 1 side, you could stitch into that ditch, or you can slip stitch. I will say slip stitching is my preferred method over stitching in the ditch. I have the hardest time getting my slip in the stitches in the ditch to just be perfect. And so I have decided that I just prefer slip stitching at this point personally. However, you definitely can go ahead and go the fast route. And the problem with that is just make sure that you have to catch the fabric on the fabric 2 side when you are slipping in the ditch from the fabric 1 side. We'll show more of that in a second. But here I am just ranting a little bit about how slipping in the ditch is partially my nemesis. After years and years and years of trying to become best friends with it to save time, I just have accepted that slip stitching is the way to go for me. So, okay, I'm gonna trim the corners on this one. I actually decided that wasn't necessary later, so ignore that I did that. Sometimes I'll just like throw in these, occasional things that I do, and I regret them. But I'm pinning it, and I'm pretty sure, am I gonna go over to the machine and do it in the ditch? I am. Yep, there it is. I thought so. Ooh, that was quite a nice little transition right there. But you can see right here, what I mean by ditch is that there's, the place where fabric 1 meets the binding fabric, and my needle is trying to go directly in between that. So we're trying to get it perfectly in the ditch, and we're hoping and praying to the sewing people of above that we will actually catch the binding fabric on the wrong side as well. You'll see that I actually did do a good job, except for that one little spot right there. I'm not gonna lie, I didn't fix that. It's gonna be fine. So now I'm looking at my pattern piece, and I'm just making sure that my pocket is going in the right spot. I kind of eyeballed it, but you could be really fancy and mark it properly with a tracing wheel. Once again, I eyeballed it, and nobody knew until now. So here we are, I'm pinning those in place, and we are going to stitch in the ditch for this. You could slip stitch the pockets on. I'm not going to recommend that though for a pocket. You do want the durability, and because you're not having to, catch fabric from the wrong side, because we slip stitched those bias binding pieces over onto the wrong side, we're just going to do it with the machine. I think it will be much, much, much more secure, and honestly, you can get a pretty good look of this, because we're just really trying to get that front side to look really, really good of us slipping in the ditch. Now,
I will put this caveat in there that you definitely could do pockets on the fabric 2 side, but stitching it together from like doing both pockets would be really, really hard. So I would say if you're going to do that, then you will need to slip stitch on the second pockets. Now, I think it looks just fine the way it is. I love having my reverse side with no pockets, and I still have like these secret pockets inside. You do you. Okay, now I am here pinning the shoulder seams together. I've got fabric 1 sides together, and I am pinning those shoulder seams. You can baste those in place. I skipped that because my fabric felt pretty sturdy. So I'm gonna go ahead and add my binding fabric. I'm gonna go ahead and make sure those raw edges are together, and I'm pinning it in place at the shoulder seams. So I'm doing that with both sides. Once again, raw edges are together, and I'm making sure that it's from the side of my front bodices, not from my back bodices, because we want, you'll see why, but basically we want it to end up on that side. So now I'm once again stitching this in place with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, doing it for both shoulder seams, because you know, you do it on one side, you got to do it on the other, and making sure I'm back stitching. Pretty much always back stitch unless you are basting. And then we are trimming down that seam allowance to that 1/4 of an inch or 6 millimeters. I probably went a teeny bit smaller than that to reduce bulk. Now this bias binding is going to be a little bit different than the bias binding we put on the pockets. We're not going to wrap it around the seam. We're actually just going to like cover the seam, and it's going to be sewn down flat. So we're not wrapping it around the seam. We're laying it down flat, and we're going to get a really nice finish from that. Now, you definitely could slip stitch this closed, but because we're not stitching in the ditch on this one, I am going to pretend like I'm going to slip stitch one, and then I'm going to actually do it by machine later, because I realized, no, I want that seam visible from the outside. I like how that stitch looks. So you can slip stitch it if you want, but because you're not slip stitching in the ditch, it's up to you. Totally up to you. I did end up unpicking this slip stitch later because I did stitch in the ditch. I didn't stitch in the ditch. I just told you not to do that. I did top stitch it or edge stitch it down. Can somebody explain to me the difference between the two? Because I feel like I use them interchangeably sometimes, and sometimes you guys get mad at me for that. I feel like it's edge stitching. Top stitching is a little bit different. We're gonna be edge stitching. I'm pretty sure that's what I put in the pattern too. But now I'm on the spot. All right, we're just gonna sit here and watch me slip stitch unnecessarily. Oh yeah, you can see right there I cut my binding just a teeny bit too short, but it's okay, it's gonna be hidden in the seam allowance. Okay, here I am edge stitching 1 millimeter from that folded over edge to make sure that it is secure. And once again, I did do that for the other side, and I unpicked all of my other stitching by hand. Okay, now we're gonna go to sleeves. We are going to get your bias binding, and we're gonna measure it out, make sure it's the same width as the bottom of your sleeve. And we're gonna open up that binding so that your wrong sides are open, and you're going to sew those short edges together with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Now this is on the bias, so don't just like pull it a lot, right? Because it'll stretch. But we're gonna just make sure that those are the right size, do our little stitching, back stitch, all the things. And then we're going to press that seam allowance open and fold it back in half, just like we had already pre-pressed it, and it will be set aside for later. Now we are going to sew up the side seams of our jacket. We've got fabric 1 facing each other, and we're going to pin those side seams of the bodice and the side seams of the sleeve together, right? So we're going all the way up and down, and we're going to do that on the other side as well. You can just watch me doing that along with my little spectator. All right, now we're grabbing our binding, raw edges together. We are going to start pinning that in place. I do think in the instructions I have you basting it before you put the bias binding on. I definitely recommend it. Doesn't mean I always follow my own advice.
So I'm pinning that bias binding in place, and then I'm trimming off the excess. And then I'm gonna go ahead and sew that in place with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. But before I do that, it looks like I'm pinning more bias binding on the other side. Now with this one, you're trying to do a 1 centimeter seam allowance as well. I would say do like a scant 1 centimeter seam allowance or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, because we're gonna be doing something different with this binding. We're doing it like the pockets. We are going to be wrapping it around the seam. So it's gonna not be flat, because it's near impossible to do it flat because of your armhole being too small and skinny. So here I am sewing it. I am doing like a scant, so like a little bit less. Ooh, that was a nice camera change right there. Now right over here we've got some bulky seams, so go slow. Don't break a needle. Go slow over that little bump right there. Some people suggest a hump jumper. Once again, not a expert at that. My machine actually has like a button that I can push that like relaxes the tension of the presser foot. If you have that setting, great. Or you can just manually lift up your presser foot a little bit to kind of help guide you over those thicker, bulkier seams. That's what I did for a decade, and it worked just lovely on my little baby brother machine that one time finally passed away. So that's why we have the Juki, which I also love. All right. We have now done that, and we are going to trim down the seam allowance. Now, once again, you can do that to a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance or 6 millimeters. I would go as small as you can go without cutting into your seam, without cutting into your stitching. Especially go smaller in that little bulky area so you don't get like this lump in your armpit. Now, we've flipped it over, so the bias binding was on the side of your bodice front, right? You can see I'm trimming this down some more. But we're going to, and you see like right here, it was just a little too thick in a couple spots. Try to get it as even as you can. But now I'm flipping the bias binding over to my bodice backside, and I'm pinning it around the seam allowance. But once again, it's not flat. It's like encasing that seam allowance as best as I can. So it's like creating like a little tube almost around it. And I'm gonna pin that in place as good as I can. Now, once again, on this step, you can sew and stitch in the ditch. And I did that on some of my versions, but I prefer how the slip stitch looks on this version. And I will say, I do think it is worth your time to do the slip stitch here. But if you're a speedy sewist and just like want to get it done, you can slip in the stitch. You can, wow, I think that I've said stitch in the ditch too many times because now it's not coming out as actual words, but you can slip, oh goodness, you can stitch in the ditch. All right, now here I am slip stitching, and I'll just put some music on and be quiet for a second so that you can stitch in peace. I do believe that I had to thread my needle 2 or 3 times to get that whole length properly done. But it looks so pretty. Oh my goodness, I felt so good when I finished that. It just looked beautiful. All right, now we're going to do the button trim. So we're gonna iron these all really nice and pretty, and we're going to fold one side in with wrong sides together. I apologize that this doesn't have a very clear wrong side, but wrong sides together by 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch, so that we have this pre-pressed edge. If you can't tell, I enjoy pre-pressing things because it makes your life easier so down the road, just having all these things pre-pressed. So we've got our button placket, and now we are going to put those on. Now the folded edge that is not what we're pinning. We are pinning the edge that wasn't folded, and we're pinning that to the side of the front bodice, or I guess technically the center of the front bodice. And we're doing that to both of them, and that folded edge is not being sewn down. We're going to stitch those with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Make sure you back stitch and that you don't sew over a needle, because I do believe I did that at some point. All right, now if you're doing the hood, you're gonna follow these following steps. If not, you're gonna scrub ahead to the timestamp that I'm putting on the screen for you. We're gonna go ahead and grab the hood pieces 7 through 9, and you're gonna place the side hood pattern piece, number 9, on a flat surface with fabric 1 facing up. Then you're gonna take the hood stripe and you're gonna start pinning it to it, fabric 1 sides together. You can see I'm using a different fabric here because the other version I was making isn't going to have a hood. This green version is. So you're seeing a couple of versions going on in this video because I made this pattern a bazillion times to get it perfectly ready for you guys, which has been awesome. Now, I'm sewing this with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. I will say this fluffy fabric is amazing, but it's a little bit thicker. It's not like heavy and bulky, but it is thicker. So I did have to increase the seam allowance just a teeny bit to like make sure everything was all good to go. Which did actually result in a slightly smaller jacket. I do think I wish I would have sized up 1 with the fluffy nature of this pattern, but still like it. It's really great. It's a vibe. I am pinning my bias binding with raw edges together along that curve. Now make sure it's on the side of the side hood, not on the side of the stripe. You want to be able to see it. You can see right there. Now, once again, I'm going to sew that in place. I did baste these together before I sewed the binding on because of the slippery nature of this fabric. I was sure to baste it. Like I said, basting is sometimes optional, but for some cases it's like actually really necessary to get a good finished result. And I noticed that my bias binding was kind of stretching as I went because of the fluffy nature of this fabric. Once I stitched it down, it kind of stretched out a little bit, so that's just something to watch out for. So I trimmed it down. I trimmed down my seam allowance, and then we are going to be pinning this binding flat. So we're not wrapping it around the seam allowance, we are laying it flat against the hood stripe, and we will be edge stitching, not top stitching. We'll be edge stitching 1 millimeter from that folded edge to secure it in place. You want to make sure when you're doing that, especially on the hood, that you're kind of stretching the hood stripe and the side hood apart from one another because we're working with some curves. So you want to make sure that you're not like, some of your fabric is like folded in on itself because of those curves. You want to kind of stretch those two pieces apart while you're sewing and when you're pinning to make sure you don't get like some weird, bulky, weird fold going on. If you've done it, you know what I'm talking about. But avoid it by pulling those pieces apart. And like I said, I'm just edge stitching right on the edge of that pre-folded edge. Once again, back stitching, and then I cut off to make sure everything was even. Great, now we're going to repeat those steps for the other side, and I'll put some music on and let you just enjoy watching me sew. All right, now you have the makings of a hood so far. You should look kind of like this. Make sure all of your bias binding is kind of trimmed to be the right size. Now you're going to go ahead and grab your hood channel piece. Now I will admit, I love how this turned out, but because of its fluffy nature, I kind of wish I had widened the hood channel just a little bit for this, but I left it as is for the pattern. It just made threading some things later a little bit more complicated. But I'm taking bias binding and I am attaching it to the raw edges of the short sides. And what we're doing here is we're just making sure that, you know, we don't have raw edges of our hood channel. And it kind of adds a cute little touch of having some contrasting fabric there. I am stitching in the ditch here because it's such a small piece. You could slip stitch this, but I flipped it around the seam allowance, kind of like our pockets. You can see it from both sides. It's around the seam allowance. And like I said, I'm just slipping in the ditch here. I did stitch in the ditch for the entirety of this pattern. I felt it was much easier with the Sherpa on the inside to get like a really clean finish. And then right here, you would normally press this hood channel in half lengthwise with fabric two sides together. But this fabric is a little bit hard to press because it is 100% polyester. And so I just pinned it in half to kind of get that same feel, but I would highly recommend pressing it if you can. Now there are two notches on the hood channel piece, and those correspond with the two seams at the top of your hood. You're gonna go ahead and line those up and then pin the rest of your way down. You wanna make sure though that you have about, let's find that exact measurement. It is not showing up. About 3/4 of an inch or 2 centimeters from the edge. There should be a little bit of space because that's where your like your tie is going to come through, so you can tighten your hood. Now on this one, I decided, because of the bulky nature of this fabric, I started sewing the hood channel onto my hood from like the top of the hood down on both sides. That was only because of the bulky fabric, and I was worried that it was going to kind of shift like all of the bias binding I've been doing, but you can start from one side if your fabric isn't that thick or shifty. But that's a little tip right there for you. And then you can see I kind of swapped. I should have started from the middle again, but I felt like it wasn't shifty enough that I clearly decided not to do that. But I'm stitching this with a 1 centimeter seam allowance, which is 3/8 of an inch. And I'm really being careful right here to make sure that I'm like getting everything lined up, because like I said, this fabric was so fun, but just a little shifty. So I just wanted to take extra care to make sure that I wasn't missing some of the seams right there. Now I'm gonna go ahead and add the bias binding. Now this doesn't, it covers completely. So it doesn't go to the end of the hood channel, it goes to the end of the hood. And you want to do raw edges together and go all the way around that hood piece. Go ahead and trim off the excess bias binding, and we're going to sew it in place with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. I do apologize, when I attached the hood channel on, you are supposed to baste it with a longer stitch length and with a slightly smaller seam allowance. I'm pretty sure I didn't do that on this because I wanted it to be extra secure, but you don't want those seams to be showing, right? And so basting it can help with that. You can see how my binding is just puckering like crazy because of how thick this fabric was. It just, as it pushes it down, I ended up with a little bit of extra binding, and it looks like I ran out of thread. I fixed that. So everything's sewn down, and now I'm going to trim the seam allowance, right? So we want to also make sure, I did check, but I think it was going too fast. I made sure that my bias binding and my hood channel, that like no weird things were popping out. Like I pulled it open to make sure everything was good to go. Now we're going to do the bias binding flat as well. So we're putting it over that seam allowance, but it's going to be flat instead of wrapping it around the seam allowance. It's going to be flat to the inside of the hood, which I think creates a really fun effect in how it looks. And also you get some really nice top stitching details from the fabric one side. And I just think that kind of adds a nice touch. So we're going to stitch but we're going to edge stitch 1 millimeter from that folded bias binding edge. And like I said, it should look really nice from the fabric one side. Now, something to keep in mind is go slow over these bulky seams, and once again, kind of pull the hood channel apart from the hood a little bit because of some of the curves to make sure you don't have any awkward bunching there. Also, I think I mentioned this previously, but I would highly recommend increasing your stitch length for thicker fabrics. It doesn't like pinch your fabric, it just like lays nicely on top of it. Now I'm going to go ahead and add my hood. There are some notches. There's a notch, I believe, on the center back, and you want to line that up. But really what really matters is that your hood is just centered on your neckline, right? If things have shifted while you were sewing, don't worry, just make sure it's centered so you don't have it like off to one side. Now I'm basting it in place with a longer stitch length. I usually do a 5 millimeter stitch length. If your machine only has 4.5, that's fine too. And then I'm doing it with a slightly smaller seam allowance, probably about 1/4 inch. And instead of the 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. So now that that is basted in place, you're about at the exact same place that the people who are not doing the hood are. And you're gonna go ahead and add that bias binding to the neckline. Now you don't need that bias binding to go all the way to this where the seam allowance is. We've already done our button placket trim, right? And you don't need it to like completely overlap, but it does need to go over the button trim, if that makes any sense. You just don't want to create a lot of excess bulk in that corner because you will be trimming that down anyways. Now we're going to sew this with a normal seam allowance of 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch. And you're going to go all the way across. Once again, I get a little bit of bunching here, but this is why I included bias binding as continuous bias binding instead of as pattern pieces, because bias binding sometimes stretches and your fabric sometimes does some wonky things. Now we're going to get down to the very end, and we want to make sure that those pre-folded edges of the button placket, that they actually stay pre-folded. You don't want those to open up. All right, now we're trimming down that seam allowance, and I don't think I showed it right here, but you also needed to add the trim to the bottom of your jacket as well. I will show that a little bit later in the non-hooded version, so you'll be able to see exactly what I'm talking about, but the bias binding has also been added to the hem. Once again, when you add that binding along that neckline and along the bottom, you want to make sure that that pre-pressed edge of the button trim is still pressed. Okay, we are folding over the bias binding at the neckline, and we are doing it flat as well. You will want to pull those pieces apart from one another, the hood from the bodice, because we're working with concave and convex curves, and we're wanting to kind of pull those seams apart to make sure that everything is good. Now we also are going to turn the button trim right over to the fabric 2 side, and you see that pre-pressed edge is already good to go and it's beautiful, so all we have to do is edge stitch it down. I did that all the way around the whole jacket, and now I am just edge stitching from that folded edge of the bias binding, about 1 millimeter, all the way around the jacket. So I'm doing the neckline first, and I think I remember halfway through that I actually wasn't supposed to do the neckline first. You're supposed to do the hem first. So when you scrub forward to the other version, you will see exactly what I'm talking about. I'm just showing you how you sew the hood on, just how you would. But we're gonna finish the jacket back to the cotton version in just a second. So here are the ties for the hood. And what you're doing here is you've already got this bias binding that's pre-pressed, folded in half, right? And what we're doing is we are folding in those raw edges to the middle. Now I've put 2 measurements in here for the drawstring. You could do a shorter version, which is 57 inches or 145 centimeters, or you can do a longer version. I did the longer version for this one, and I think that my floral one has the shorter version. I liked having both options in there depending on if you want to like have a bow tie or whatnot. So you just pick whichever one you want. They both will work. Now I sewed with the, you can see right here, I'm folding the edges of my bias binding in half, like wrong ways together, and then I sewed a seam, cut the seam allowances off, and folded it right side out, and now I'm edge stitching these folds closed. Now that just creates a really, really nice edge. These pattern instructions are on page 61. I do apologize that this has skipped around just a little bit in this section because the hood, but you can do it in this order in the video or the order in the instructions. But you do the hood, and then you also need to create your drawstrings, and this is the way that I do them. And once again, the drawstring instructions are on page 61 and 62. So now we're going to go back, and we're going to we're going to trim all of our threads. We're going to add a safety pin, and we're going to use that safety pin to help us thread this drawstring through the hood channel. Now, because my hood channel was lined with Sherpa, it was a little sticky, and it took me a minute to get it through. This is at 300 times speed, so it took a minute. Now, if you're wondering, when do I put in the elastic? It's because I didn't show it to you, like I said. That is going to be on page 56 of your instructions, and you will have already done it at this point if you are sewing it in the order of the instructions. I'm going to show you that in just a second on the non-quilted version, so don't worry, it's coming up. We eventually did actually thread this drawstring through. It just took a little bit of time. But the safety pin just really helps give you something to hold on to push through all the way. So you unpin it, and then you just pull it through until that drawstring is even all the way through. Now on this one, I'm going to go ahead and show you how I did the buttons. Because this was a thicker fabric, I found like that my button placket, just because of the bulk, it felt a little bit thinner, and my buttons were just a little bit bigger. So I did end up doing my buttonholes vertically. The pattern does call for horizontal buttonholes. That's just a suggestion. So I just flipped them vertical for the purposes of this jacket, but the rest of my jackets, I believe, have them horizontal. This is completely up to you. You can use the button placket guide that's on your button trim, or you can measure them out differently if you want them spaced out more or spaced out less. I believe that the buttons are about 3 3/4 of an inch apart, which would be, well, how much would that be? That'd be like 8 centimeters, 8.5 centimeters apart from one another. So just remember, this is like free flowing. I did finally figure out how to do buttonholes on my machine, because I was actually supposed to put the fabric between the 2 plates. Should have read the instruction manual, but now doing buttonholes has been so much better. I don't super love the position of that buttonhole. However, I did put it a little bit to the side, but I decided to leave it because this fabric leaves puncture marks. So I highly recommend doing test buttonholes if you can. That one felt a little bit better. Still a little off to the side. I think they gradually just got a little bit more centered as I did it. And I'm going to embrace the handmade nature of this jacket. But yeah, like I said, this was kind of a you do it and you do it one time kind of a buttonhole situation. No unpicking was going to save me from that. Everybody's buttonholers will be different, obviously, so the best advice I can give for buttonholes is just read the instruction manual for your specific machine, because each machine is so different. I've done buttonholes on Berninas and Jukis, Industrials, and my original brother, and each experience is so different, and no buttonholer is made the same. Mine is automatic, so it is automatically making the size properly for my button shape and size, but each one is different. I've heard a lot of people really enjoy doing it manually. I have done it manually before with mixed results. Now that I actually, read the manual, it's going much better. So not too mad about that. Great. And then I did sew those buttons on off camera. I will show you how to sew on the buttons. I put buttons on both sides of the button trim, which I will show you in just a minute on my other version, but this one I did off camera. So I'm cutting open those buttonholes, and now I'm going to show you how to finish the coat with the elastic. And if you don't have a hood, you're just going to pin around that neckline. So the same thing that I'm doing to the neckline, you need to do to the hem of your jacket. I apologize, I did not get a video of that, but you're doing the exact same thing to the neckline as you are to the hem. And so you will see it in just a second, but it's on top of the button trim right here sewn down, and I'm trimming the corners, and we're going to trim the corners up here as well, so that once we flip everything out, it looks really nice. If you watch the hooded section, you'll see that we're basically doing the exact same thing for both. The only difference is that there is a hood on the hooded version that has been sewn down on the neckline. I'm trimming all of my seam allowances, trimming all of my corners, and just trimming down that seam allowance to 1/4 of an inch or 6 millimeters, or even a little bit smaller, maybe 3 millimeters, and an 1/8 of an inch would be probably ideal. That's really going to do the trick right there. When I tell you that working with this fabric in particular was my favorite, it felt like I was sewing with like butter. It was so soft, has a really beautiful drape. I loved it. And then the linen, it was just really, really nice. So I'm flipping everything to the fabric 2 side. I use my scissors to push out my corners, which I know is kind of a big no-no, but I don't have a special tool. I'm just gentle, but make sure you don't push too hard and cut through your corners. I actually haven't done that in probably a decade, so watch, I'll do it next week. But you know, just be gentle and be smart about not pushing through too hard. So now we're on the fabric 2 side, and we are going to be not wrapping this around the seam allowance, we are wrapping this flat. So we are wrapping this, and the bias binding will only be seen from the fabric 2 side. You will not be seeing it from the fabric 1 side. And we are going to do the same with the button placket. You're going to do the button trim. And you're going to do that, and you'll see it's a little bit wider. And then I did find that I needed to iron that. It looks like I'm staring at my iron, but I did actually iron it flat. My camera started having some major issues at this point. This is where we add the elastic. So I know that for my size, I need 19 inches. And that back piece between the side seams, I'm going to stitch it down. I'm going to edge stitch it down. You're going to go all the way, just basically, we're just doing the trim along the back bodice. We're just stitching it down. Everywhere else has been pinned, but we're just stitching it there. Now I cut mine to the 19 inches. I do think I shortened mine a little bit because the recovery on this elastic was absolutely terrible. And by recovery, I mean you stretch it and then it bounces back. Like, it wasn't strong elastic at all. So I shortened it a little bit to account for that. But you could of course adjust it to your desired length. I pinned one side of my elastic down to the fabric so it wouldn't like get stretched into the tube of fabric. And with the safety pin method, I pulled it through the bias binding. It takes a minute because we're dealing with, you know, some bulk here and just not a lot of room. I also think that I used 1/4 of an inch elastic because I was out of the recommended size. It worked just fine. But like I said, I did have to make some accommodations by shortening it a teeny bit. And once you get to this side seam, just remember it's a little bit harder at the side seams. I pulled it through and I pinned it in place, which is naturally out of frame. There we go. And we're going to stitch down the side seam. So I'm doing it horizontal. I'm doing it vertical. And so it's securing that elastic in place, and I'm doing that on both sides.
Now, if you're really fancy, you could stitch in the ditch from the right side or from the fabric one side. I didn't care enough to do that. And then what I'm doing here is unpinning the elastic and just cutting it. I left a little bit of room, and then I'm going around my merry way and going around the rest of the jacket, doing this edge stitch. And once you get to this corner piece, I pivot. So I'll lift up the presser foot and pivot. Now we're doing the button trim. Oh, there it is. I was about to say I'm genuinely impressed with myself. I've been pulling my pins out almost this entire video, and then I sewed over a pin. So here we go. Go a little bit slower over the bulky seams. Right now I'm doing the neckline, I'm edge stitching it down. If you are doing it with a hood, you will just be doing the exact same thing, but there will be a hood on your right side. Get to the bottom of the button trim, and you're going to continue to stitch that edge stitching all the way to the side seam where we had already started. And it looks like I didn't cut my elastic yet, so I'm just going to go ahead and cut that, and we back stitch. Now, I'm going to highly recommend that this elastic in the back, that you steam it. So elastic responds really cool to steam and heat. It will scrunch up better. I also find that personally, any gathers that I have, which is what is created by the elastic, they look better when pressed a little bit. I would recommend not skipping that step. Otherwise it might look a little weird. Okay. So now I am adding that pre-done binding for the sleeves. I'm putting the seams matching up and the raw edges together, and I'm going to stitch around and around. Now, these sleeves are too thin for me to take out the section of my sewing machine to like do it around my sewing machine, so I'm just kind of doing it this way. There's a name for all of those things, and because I've been talking for 40 minutes about sewing, those names have escaped me. I did this with a little bit of a smaller seam allowance. I did a 7mm seam allowance because this binding had like stretched a little bit and became thinner than it was supposed to be. So I found that doing a smaller seam allowance was going to be easier for this. Then I flipped it around to the fabric 2 side of the fabric, and I pinned my bias binding around the seam allowance, so it's visible from both the fabric 1 side and the fabric 2 side. And once again, right here, we've got this stitching in the ditch option. You could stitch in the ditch, or you could do what I did and you could slip stitch it. I really, really enjoyed the slip stitching on this jacket in particular. I think because it was a quilted, like a pre-quilted fabric that feels like a quilt, like a real quilt. Like I actually feel like I'm wearing a blanket when I wear it, that I just wanted it to like have this real handmade nature to it. Whereas my polyester one, I kind of just stitched. Nope, I did actually, I'm holding it right now. I did actually slip stitch this part, just because it's so little, you know, the circumference is so small that it just makes it a little tricky on your sewing machine to go around and around. But totally up to you. You know what stitching in the ditch looks like now, so you make an educated decision on what is best for you and your fabric. And if you're just like so ready to be done, then just stitch in the ditch and it's gonna look great. So once you're at this step, you're pretty much like in the home stretch, right? But don't give up, right? We're on page 59. Don't give up. Make sure you get those buttonholes in and the buttons, because you will love having both of those in there. I couldn't find my pattern piece, but the pattern piece for the button trim does have a guide that shows you where the buttonholes are supposed to be. So I just had to like actually use my pattern making skills and, you know, remember how far apart they were, but we got there. I did the buttonholes on this one horizontally, and I did these really, really cute buttons. I had these quilty buttons and these croissant buttons, and I did the size for my buttonhole, the size of the bigger button, because the croissant buttons were a little smaller, but it'll work for both. I set up my machine and I did do these horizontal. If you watch the quilted portion of this video, you will see that I did my buttonholes vertical due to spacing. And if you want to watch me make a million buttonholes, you can go back and watch me do that in the hooded version. But here's me making a buttonhole, and that one actually I think went pretty smoothly. So that was very exciting. Always a good day. And then I trim the threads off, and then I use scissors to cut into this. I know there are many other methods, but I find doing scissors is my preferred method. I had to bring out the heavy duty ones. Trimming all of my threads. I'm notorious for like a week later being like, oh, I did not trim all those threads off, or even like a year or two later, there's always like a little thread. So now here I am, I'm going to sew on the button. I do one button at a time, but I'm securing my thread by going through the knot, and then I'm putting the button on one side, and then to make this fully reversible, I'm putting the croissant button on the other side. And I'm not pulling the threads too tight here. You don't want it to be like super loose, but you don't want it to be too tight, because we're dealing with a thicker fabric, right? If I was being like super fancy in how, you know, professional seamstresses would be, you would put like a toothpick between the fabric and your button to create like a shank. But what I do is I just wrap it around. Saves me some time. So I wrap the thread around the buttonhole, the button and the thread a few times to create some width. And that's it, guys. That's it. You've made a jacket. Here's me modeling the green version, and you can see it's fully reversible. I have buttons on both sides. This is my floral version, and I just love them all, and I hope that you had the best time making this quilted jacket.